Welcome back to History's Greatest Crimes. I'm Michael.
And I'm Alana. Today we're diving deep into a story that became more legend than history. A tale of love, desperation, and a bloody trail across Depression-era America.
We're talking about Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. Names that conjure images of rebellious glamour, of star-crossed lovers taking on a broken system.
That's right, Michael. When people think of Bonnie and Clyde, they often think of that iconic photograph of Bonnie holding a pistol, her foot up on the bumper of a Ford, and a cigar clamped in her mouth. Or one of the other photographs taken around the same time that show the couple cuddled up together and being playful with each other. It's easy to romanticize the two of them, and the photos might even be considered charming if not for the constant presence of loaded firearms in each one.
But behind the myth, behind the grainy photographs, lies a story far more complex, far more brutal, and ultimately far more tragic. As Bonnie Parker herself prophetically wrote in her poem, The Trail's End, quote, "Someday they'll go down together, they'll bury them side by side. To few it'll be grief, to the law a relief, but it's death for Bonnie and Clyde," end quote. That poem, a chilling piece of foreshadowing, hints at the fatalism that clung to them.
We'll sift through the nitty-gritty, the eyewitness accounts, the family recollections, the official reports, to uncover the truth behind one of America's most infamous duos, their crimes, their violent ending, and their historical legacy. To understand Bonnie and Clyde, we first have to understand the world they were born into, the early 1930s. At that time, America was in the grip of the Great Depression. Just a couple years before, in October of 1929, the nation's obsession with consumerism and credit led to a swift and drastic drop in the value of the stock market. The Republican administration of Herbert Hoover insisted that the government shouldn't intervene to help fix the system. Instead, they argued that if everyone was patient enough, the national economy would right itself.
But that simply turned out to be the wrong approach to the Depression. Over the next couple of years, banks continued to fail, farmers were foreclosed on left and right, and for millions, hope was a scarce commodity. The country's money had declined by 38%, and nearly 40% of farmers were forced from their lands. This widespread economic hardship created an environment of desperation and, for some, a deep-seated resentment towards the institutions they felt had failed them.
The societal fabric was unraveling. Trust in traditional institutions, particularly banks and big business, crumbled as many ordinary people lost their life savings and livelihoods. This erosion of faith was a significant factor in the public's complex perception of outlaws like Bonnie and Clyde. While their actions were undeniably criminal, some segments of the population, beaten down by the Depression, viewed bank robbers with a strange mixture of fear and fascination, sometimes even as folk heroes striking back at the rigged system.
In Texas, where our story begins, conditions were particularly harsh. For families like the Parkers and the Barrows, poverty wasn't just a statistic, it was a daily, grinding reality. John Neal Phillips, in his meticulously researched book Running with Bonnie and Clyde, paints a stark picture of this era. Quote, "The world was a miserable, wretched place to be in the 1930s. It was a time when death lurked around every street corner. While a handful of men were getting rich, the average citizen was being whittled shorter and shorter with every skimpy meal," end quote. This pervasive desperation, this sense of a system broken, undoubtedly shaped the choices of many, including the actions of Bonnie and Clyde.
As we'll discuss in just a minute, Bonnie's family, the Parkers, was led by a single mom who worked hard to keep her family afloat. In similarly dire situation, Clyde's family, the Barrows, were tenant farmers, those who rented land to farm rather than owning it. This was a widespread practice in the South, and throughout the region, many tenant farmers lived in poverty, struggling to make a living as crop prices plummeted during the Great Depression. Making matters worse, as the Depression dragged on through the 1930s, landowners facing financial ruin themselves frequently evicted tenants to cut costs.
It's crucial to remember this backdrop. The Depression didn't excuse their crimes, but it provides a vital context for their motivations and, importantly, for the way their story was received and later mythologized. The anger and the disillusionment many felt towards banks, which were foreclosing on homes and farms, meant that those who targeted these institutions sometimes found a degree of sympathy, or at least a morbid curiosity, from a public hungry for any distraction from their own hardships.
So let's turn now to talk about the two lovers themselves.
Let's dig into it. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October 1st, 1910, in Rowena, Texas. She was the second of 3 children. Her father, a bricklayer, died when she was only 4, a devastating blow that plunged the family into poverty. Her mother, Emma Krause Parker, a figure who would later contribute her own recollections in the books Fugitives, the story of Clyde, Barrow, and Bonnie Parker, moved the family to Cement City, a hard-scrabble suburb of Dallas, to be closer to relatives. There, Bonnie's mother worked as a seamstress.
And I think it's really interesting that Emma Parker's accounts portray Bonnie as a sweet and innocent girl before her fateful meeting with Clyde. He appears to be her watershed moment.
I agree, Alana. Although I also think there was something about Bonnie's personality that made her more open to the high-stakes lifestyle she eventually adopted. Despite the poverty that marked her upbringing, Bonnie was a bright student, excelling in school, particularly in writing and public speaking. She harbored aspirations beyond the bleak horizons of Cement City, dreaming of a life with more glamour and opportunity. This yearning found its most poignant expression in her poetry. These weren't just idle scribblings of a small child, they were a window into her soul, revealing a romantic, fatalistic, and surprisingly articulate young woman.
In her poem, The Street Girl, for instance, she wrote of longing for, quote, Santa Claus men who would provide, quote, glamour, money, and opportunity. This desire for escaping and a, quote, providing male figure became a recurring theme, deeply rooted in the loss of her father and the subsequent financial struggles her family endured. In other words, she would be very interesting to Freud. But her poetry often reflected a keen awareness of their doomed past. Another poem, called The Story of Suicide Sal, penned while she was briefly jailed in Kaufman County, Texas in the spring of 1932, uses the persona of Sal to explore themes of betrayal and the harsh realities faced by a country girl in the city. Sal, who can be seen as a stand-in for Bonnie herself, laments, quote, Then I left my old home for the city to play in its mad, dizzy whirl, not knowing how little of pity it holds for a country girl, end quote.
Bonnie's romantic inclinations led her to an early marriage to Roy Thornton. It was a tumultuous relationship. Bonnie and Roy dropped out of school and married on September 25th, 1926, just 6 days before her 16th birthday. Roy himself was only 17.
Their youth, their personalities, and their circumstances contributed to a very short-lived relationship. Thornton was often absent, involved in his own criminal activities, and eventually landed in prison. Bonnie's disillusionment is palpable in a journal entry where she wrote, quote, I have a roaming husband with a roaming eye, end quote. In December of 1927, less than a year and a half into their marriage, the two separated.
This failed marriage, coupled with the loss of her father, appears to have made Bonnie Parker tragically receptive to someone the likes of Clyde Barrow when he entered her life.
So, who was Clyde Barrow?
Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born on March 24, 1909, near Tellico, Texas. He was the 5th of 7 children. His family were tenant farmers mired in the same desperate poverty that characterized Bonnie's early life. In the early 20s, the Barrows, like the Parkers, moved to the slums of West Dallas, a neighborhood rife with crime and limited opportunities. In fact, the Barrow family experienced such poverty that for their first months in Dallas, they lived under their wagon until they got enough money to buy a tent.
Clyde's older brother Marvin, better known as Buck, was an early and significant influence, drawing Clyde into the life of petty theft, stealing turkeys and cars, which gradually escalated to more serious offenses.
Clyde's encounters with the law began early. He was first arrested in Waco in 1926 for attempted car theft, and in the ensuing years, He held some legitimate jobs, while on the side he continued to participate in criminal acts like cracking safes, robbing stores, and continuing to steal cars. But it was his incarceration at Eastham Prison Farm beginning in April of 1930 that irrevocably shaped the man he would become.
Eastham was no ordinary prison. It was a brutal institution. Accounts paint a grim picture of conditions there during the 1920s and 30s. Inadequate state funding led to a cascade of problems. As noted by one source, the hired guards were often incompetent, uneducated persons, sadists, and drifters. Farming, the primary labor for inmates, was carried out with primitive methods. Discipline was harsh and often arbitrary. Whipping was a common punishment, not just for major infractions, but for minor ones like picking dirty cotton or acting stubborn and lazy.
Lee Simmons, he was the general manager of the Texas prison system from 1930 to 1935, openly admitted to using the whip on criminals. This systemic brutality created an environment where violence was endemic.
It was in this crucible of violence that Clyde Barrow was forged. Inside Eastham, he endured horrific abuse, including repeated sexual assault by another inmate. In a desperate act of self-preservation and retaliation, Clyde killed his tormentor with a lead pipe, his first murder. Another inmate, already serving a life sentence, took the blame, shielding Clyde from immediate repercussions.
But the brutality of Eastham didn't end there. To avoid the backbreaking labor in the cotton fields, Clyde, in late January 1932, had another inmate chop off 2 of his toes with an axe. This self-mutilation, a desperate act to gain a brief respite in the infirmary, left him with permanent limp.
What's ironic, though, is that Clyde's mother had already successfully petitioned for his release without Clyde's knowledge, and 6 days after he suffered his intentional injury, he was paroled.
Yikes, I'm not sure whether to consider that good or bad luck on his part.
Maybe a bit of both, but the Clyde Barrow who emerged from Eastham Prison was a changed man. His sister Marie later said, quote, "Something awful sure must have happened to him in prison because he wasn't the same person when he got out," end quote.
Ralph Fultz, a fellow inmate who befriended Clyde at Eastham, provided one of the most chilling descriptions of this transformation. Fultz, initially unimpressed by the diminutive Barrow, stated he watched Clyde, quote, "change from a schoolboy to a rattlesnake," end quote. Fultz also recalled Clyde's simmering rage, quote, "I'd like to shoot all these damn guards and turn everybody loose," end quote.
This deep-seated bitterness and desire for revenge became a driving force in Clyde's subsequent actions. According to historian John Neal Phillips, Clyde Barrow's primary motivation after his release was not fame or fortune, but to seek revenge against the Texas prison system for the abuses that he had sustained while serving time.
Clyde vowed himself to his mother, quote, "Mama, I'm never going to work again, and I'll never stand arrest either. I'm not ever going back to that Eastham hellhole. I'll die first. I swear it. They're going to have to kill me," end quote.
This wasn't mere bravado. It was a declaration that would define the rest of Clyde Barrow's short, violent life.
The date was January 5th, 1930. The place, West Dallas. Bonnie Parker, then 19 and separated from her incarcerated husband Roy Thornton, was at the home of Clyde's friend Clarence Clay. Clyde Barrow, 20 years old, walked through the door.
Emma Parker, Bonnie's mother, described their meeting in her published memoirs as happening, quote, "so simply, as such momentous and life-changing things often do," end quote.
Legend has it Bonnie was in the kitchen making hot chocolate when Clyde arrived. This attraction, by most accounts, was instantaneous and intense. Many historians believe that Bonnie's decision to join Clyde on his criminal path was primarily driven by her deep love for him.
That's rather charming as far as criminals go, I guess.
Charming, I guess, yeah. Bonnie and Clyde's bond formed quickly. Bonnie saw Clyde as a, quote, kindred spirit who shared her desire for excitement and rebellion against a society they believed had failed them, end quote. But their whirlwind romance was soon interrupted. Just weeks after their meeting, Clyde was arrested for burglary and auto theft and sent to the McLennan County Jail.
This is where Bonnie's commitment took a decisive turn. She visited Clyde regularly, and on March 11th, 1930, she smuggled a gun into the jail, enabling his escape along with 2 other inmates.
This act transformed Bonnie from a sympathetic girlfriend into an active accomplice. Though Clyde was recaptured a week later in Ohio and subsequently sent to the brutal Easton prison farm, Bonnie's daring assistance cemented the intensity of their connection from the very beginning.
As we mentioned, Clyde Barrow was paroled from the dreaded Easton prison farm in February of 1932, a man hardened and embittered by his experiences. He immediately sought out Bonnie Parker, and their life of crime began almost at once.
But despite the later romanticized image of the couple, their early criminal endeavors were marked by ineptitude. One historian noted that, quote, lacking the sophistication to plot robberies of big city banks, the Barrow gang preyed mostly on small mom-and-pop groceries and service stations. Even at that, they often came up empty-handed and were reduced to breaking into gum machines for meal money, end quote.
Their targets were indeed modest in the beginning. Gas stations and small grocery stores were their usual fare. On May 12, 1932, a wanted report from Lufkin, Texas, specifically named Clyde Barrow for the robbery of an oil station using firearms. These early reports are often sparse on narrative detail, focusing more on the charge and the wanted status of the perpetrators.
Another crime documented by a wanted poster was a daylight robbery of a Piggly Wiggly store in Abilene, Texas on October 13, 1932. The poster named Clyde Barrow, Raymond Hamilton, and significantly, quote, Bonnie Parker alias Bonnie Thornton alias Bonnie Smith, end quote, as being wanted for the armed robbery. This early inclusion of Bonnie as an active participant, even with aliases, is critical. It counters any later attempts to portray her merely as a reluctant companion in the initial stages of their spree.
The gang's lineup was fluid in these early days. Raymond Hamilton was a frequent accomplice, and by the time he was 20 years old, he had accumulated a prison sentence of 362 years. Like Bonnie and Clyde, Raymond Hamilton was very familiar with poverty. He was born in a tent on the bank of the Deep Fork River in Oklahoma in 1914. His father abandoned the family of 2 boys and 4 girls when Raymond was 10 years old. His mother moved the family to West Dallas around that time to look for work.
By Christmas Eve 1932, a new, tragically young face joined their ranks, 16-year-old W.D. Jones. Jones had been a friend of the Barrow family since his childhood. In a voluntary statement to the Dallas police after his capture a year later, he recounted his initiation into the Barrow gang. Quote, about 2 days before Christmas 1932, Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker passed by. Clyde suggested to me that I go with them down the road, as he put it. I agreed to go, and I got in the car, and we started south of Dallas. End quote.
Jones's statement also sheds light on the gang's methods and Clyde's often forceful leadership. He described an early attempted store holdup in Temple, Texas. Quote, Clyde Barrow handed me an old .45 caliber single action pistol and told me that we were going to hold up the store. I didn't want to do it, but he insisted that I go in with him. I was worried and scared, and I shook my head at him to indicate that I would not take part in it, and I turned and started out of the store, end quote. Clyde was reportedly furious with Jones' reluctance.
But it appears that Jones got the hang of things quickly. The next day, Christmas Day, Jones and Clyde Barrow were attempting to steal a car when the owner, Doyle Johnson, a young family man, confronted them. Johnson was shot in the throat at close range and died the following day. Once again, accounts differ on who pulled the trigger. The Barrow family blamed Jones, but it's widely believed to have been Clyde. The unreliability of gang members' testimonies, often self-serving and contradictory, make piecing together the exact details of these events a constant challenge for historians. W.D. Jones, for instance, often tried to portray himself as an unwilling participant, a narrative that clashes with his continued presence at numerous violent crimes.
But even before the young W.D. Jones joined the Barrow gang, Clyde Barrow and his other associates, Bonnie Parker and Raymond Hamilton, had already left a violent trail in their wake.
Earlier in the year, April 30th, 1932, the owner of a general store in Hillsboro, Texas was killed during a robbery. While some accounts suggest Clyde was only the getaway driver, the victim's wife identified Clyde from police photographs as one of the shooters. Raymond Hamilton was also implicated in this crime.
Then on August 5th, 1932, in Stringtown, Oklahoma, the violence escalated further. Clyde, Raymond Hamilton, and another associate, Ross Dyer, were drinking moonshine at an outdoor country dance when they are approached by Atoka County Sheriff C.G. Maxwell and Deputy Eugene Moore. According to reports, as Sheriff Maxwell began to speak, saying, quote, "You can consider yourself under arrest," end quote, Barrow and Hamilton opened fire. Deputy Moore was killed instantly, the first law enforcement officer to die at the hands of the Barrow gang. Sheriff Maxwell was gravely wounded but survived.
The year 1933 marked a significant escalation in the Barrow gang's violence and their rise to national notoriety. On July 6th in Dallas, Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker, and W.D. Jones stumbled into a police trap intended for another criminal. In the ensuing chaos, Clyde shot and killed Tarrant County Deputy Malcolm Davis. This brought the gang's death toll to 5 since April of the previous year.
A pivotal moment came on March 22nd of 1933 when Clyde's older brother, Marvin Buck Barrow, recently pardoned and released from prison, joined the gang along with his wife, Blanche Caldwell Barrow. They met up with Clyde, Bonnie, and W.D. Jones in Joplin, Missouri. Blanche Barrow's memoir, My Life with Bonnie and Clyde, provides a rare and often harrowing insider's perspective, though it's a perspective colored by her own experiences and loyalties. Many reviewers note that Blanche often downplayed her and Buck's roles in the gang's crimes.
A few weeks later, on April 13, 1933, 5 lawmen raided the gang's rented apartment. They were acting in response to a tip from a neighbor who thought that the loud late-night card games and out-of-state license plates pointed to being bootleggers. When the police showed up, a fierce gun battle erupted.
Joplin Police Detective Harry McGinnis and Newton County Constable J.W. Wes Harriman were killed in the exchange. Barrow gang member W.D. Jones was shot in the side, and Buck Barrow was grazed by a bullet.
During the shootout, Bonnie, from the apartment above the garage, reportedly yelled down to Clyde, "Pour it on him, Clyde, we're coming down."
The gang made a desperate escape, but in their haste, they left behind a treasure trove of personal belongings. This included a significant arsenal of weapons, Buck Barrow's parole papers, a handwritten poem by Bonnie, and most crucially, a camera with several rolls of undeveloped film. The Joplin Globe newspaper developed and published these photographs.
The Joplin photographs were a media sensation. At the beginning of this episode, we mentioned these iconic photos of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow posing in front of a stolen car with guns and expressing some PDA. And it was through these published photos that the romanticized personas of Bonnie and Clyde, the star-struck criminal couple who would only be separated by death.
As one historian of the famous couple noted, quote, "Thanks to newsreels, true crime magazines, and newfangled wire services that transmitted scandalous photos of Bonnie smoking a cigar to every newspaper in the nation, the Barrow gang members almost instantly became a household name," end quote.
These images, coupled with Bonnie's poetry like the story of Suicide Sal, which was also found at the Joplin hideout, transformed them from regional criminals into national anti-heroes. The media narrative began to take shape, often romanticizing their youth, their perceived rebellion, and what was seen as their illicit, passionate love affair. So whether they intended to or not, Bonnie and Clyde and their gang were becoming famous for their criminal activity. But fame wasn't necessarily a good thing for them. In July of 1933, they sought refuge at the Red Crown Tourist Court outside of Platte City, Missouri. Their suspicious behavior alerted the manager and eventually Platte County Sheriff Holt Coffey.
Quite honestly, Michael, it's like they wanted to be caught. or perhaps they were really just bad criminals. But apparently, Blanche Barrow registered the party as 3 guests, but the owner could clearly see 5 people getting out of a car. He noted that the driver backed into the garage gangster style for a quick getaway. Blanche was also dressed in Jodford riding breeches, which attracted attention since that wasn't the typical attire for women in the area. And when the group paid for their rooms and dinners, they did so with coins rather than bills. They then proceeded to tape newspapers over the windows in their rented rooms.
That is all very odd behavior, even outside of the circumstances. And perhaps stupid behavior like this from people who were trying to avoid being recognized got them recognized and captured for their crimes.
Right? So eventually, the owner called Sheriff Coffey. He arrived, quickly realized that he was outgunned. So he sought assistance from Jackson County, which provided an armored car. During the early hours of July 20th, around 1 a.m., a posse of 12 lawmen moved in. Sheriff Coffey knocked on Buck and Blanche's door, announcing, quote, "Open up in the name of the law," end quote.
The response was immediate and violent. Clyde, Buck, and W.D. Jones unleashed a hail of bullets from the Browning automatic rifles. In the ensuing firefight, Buck Barrow was struck in the head. One account states, quote, "A bullet fired by Captain Baxter struck Buck in the left temple and exited his forehead," end quote.
Blanche was also injured, struck by shattered glass in both eyes, temporarily blinding her. In her memoir, Blanche recounted the terror of that night and the sight of Buck's devastating injuries, screaming, quote, "They've killed Buck!" But despite his wound, Buck reportedly continued firing. Blanche, in a state of shock and desperation, managed to get herself and her dying husband to the getaway car. The gang once again managed to escape, but Buck's injury was clearly catastrophic.
The now heavily wounded gang sought refuge in the abandoned Dexfield amusement park near Dexter, Iowa. But a few days later, on July 24th, their presence was discovered when a local farmer found bloody bandages and alerted the authorities.
A large posse numbering around 50 men, including Des Moines police officers, converged on their campsite. Another intense gun battle erupted. Clyde was hit in the shoulder. Buck Barrow, already near death, was shot again. This time, there would be no escape for him or Blanche. She was captured at the scene.
W.D. Jones, in his later statement, described the desperate flight. Quote, "We were all wounded except Blanche. Bonnie, Clyde, and I took off, leaving Blanche and Buck," end quote. They managed to commandeer a car from the nearby Feller farm. Marvell Feller, who was present, recalled Clyde, armed and desperate, telling his father, quote, "The laws are shooting the hell out of us, and all we need is the car to get out of here," end quote.
Buck Barrow died from his wounds 5 days later in a Perry, Iowa hospital. Blanche, captured and blinded, faced imprisonment. The relentless violence and constant flight were taking a devastating toll, a stark contrast to the romanticized image being cultivated in the press. Blanche's memoir serves as a crucial primary source, offering a raw counter-narrative to the myth detailing what she called a, quote, "awful existence."
By late 1933, the Barrow gang was unraveling. As mentioned, Buck was dead, and Blanche had been captured and arrested. W.D. Jones, weary of the violence and constant running, left the gang in early September. He was captured in Houston in November 1933. His detailed confession to the Dallas police provided law enforcement with invaluable intelligence about the gang's operations, their habits, and the remaining members.
In early 1934, the Barrow gang was still on the run, but it was down a few members. Only Buck Barrow was dead, but Blanche Barrow was in jail, as was the former member Raymond Hamilton, who had been arrested some time before. And W.D. Jones had left the group only to be captured and arrested. So it was really only Bonnie and Clyde left at that moment.
So they needed manpower, and Clyde Barrow saw an interesting opportunity to get both more members and revenge against the Texas prison system that had brutalized him.
That's right, Michael. With Bonnie by his side, Clyde orchestrated the escape of 5 prisoners from Eastham Prison, including his former associate, Raymond Hamilton, and Henry Methvin. Methvin, who had been unknown to the Barrow gang before, had been in the process of serving a 10-year sentence for armed robbery when he escaped with them.
The raid on the prison was carried out with a barrage of machine gun fire to cover the escapees. The Paris, Texas Evening News headline on January 16, 1934 screamed, quote, "Clyde Barrow rescues 5 convicts in machine gun raid on prison farm." During the chaotic escape, prison guard Major Joe Crowson was shot and killed.
The Eastham raid, while a personal victory for Clyde's vendetta, was a fatal miscalculation. The murder of a prison guard galvanized the Texas prison system and law enforcement across multiple states. The gloves were off. As historian John Neal Phillips notes, this event intensified the manhunt significantly. It led to the hiring of Frank Hamer, a legendary former Texas Ranger, to investigate, and their efforts demonstrated a clear shift towards a shoot-to-kill policy.
The violence continued its relentless pace. Near Grapevine, Texas, on Easter Sunday, State Highway Patrolman E.B. Wheeler and H.D. Murphy were driving when they saw Bonnie and Clyde's vehicle. It was stopped on the side of the road, which likely made the lawman think the car was disabled and needed some help. They were gunned down in cold blood. An eyewitness, a local farmer, provided an account of the murders. Henry Methvin later claimed he fired the first shot, possibly in panic.
Just 5 days later, on April 6th, the gang's car became stuck in the mud near Commerce, Oklahoma. When Constable Cal Campbell and Police Chief Percy Boyd approached, they were met with gunfire. Constable Campbell was killed, Chief Boyd was abducted, and later wounded before being released.
Amidst the murders, the gang continued their pattern of small-scale robberies, hitting banks in Iowa, including the First National Bank in Stuart on April 16, 1934, where they netted about $1,500. Desperate and on the run and in need of money, they continued to rob banks in their path, increasingly becoming more reckless and exhibiting more violent and murderistic behavior. So for over 3 years now, law enforcement agencies had been frustrated by Bonnie and Clyde. A major challenge was the jurisdictional limitations. In the 1930s, local police forces were often ill-equipped to handle highly mobile outlaw gangs that frequently crossed county and state lines. Local police couldn't just cross jurisdictions, and the authorities in different states often had no way of linking the crimes due to a lack of some sort of centralized information and awareness of other cases.
Communication between different law enforcement agencies was another significant hurdle. There was no unified system for sharing intelligence on criminal activities or suspect movements across various jurisdictions. This fragmented approach played directly into the hands of outlaws like Bonnie and Clyde, who expertly exploited these gaps.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation, then known just simply as the Bureau of Investigation, officially entered the chase in December of 1932. Their jurisdiction was primarily based on the interstate transportation of stolen vehicles, a federal offense. The Bureau distributed wanted notices with fingerprints, photographs, and criminal records to law enforcement agencies nationwide. Declassified FBI files from 2009 reveal the extent of interagency cooperation, with the Bureau often acting as a clearinghouse for the spread of information across the Midwest.
The relentless violence, particularly the Eastham prison raid and the murders of lawmen and prison guards, marked a turning point. In February 1934, the head of the Texas prison system hired legendary former Texas Ranger Frank Hamer as a special investigator with a clear mandate: stop Bonnie and Clyde. Frank Hamer, renowned for his toughness, marksmanship, and investigative prowess, was given a stark directive, quote, "Put him on the spot, know you're right, and shoot everybody in sight," end quote.
Hamer approached the manhunt with methodical precision. He famously stated, quote, "An officer must know the habits of the outlaw, how he thinks and how he will act in different situations. When I began to understand Clyde Barrow's mind, I felt that I was making progress," end quote. He meticulously studied their movements, identifying a pattern, a wide, quote, "circle through the lower Midwest, skirting state borders wherever he could take advantage of the fact that law officers could not pursue suspects across state lines," end quote. The anchor points to this deadly circuit where Dallas, Joplin, Missouri, and Northwest Louisiana.
The crucial break came through an informant, the family of Barrow gang member Henry Methvin. Fearing for his own family's safety and the inevitable violent end for his son, Henry's father, Ivy Methvin, made a deal with the authorities. He would help lure Bonnie and Clyde into an ambush in exchange for a pardon for Henry in Texas. While the FBI had no authority to grant a Texas pardon, Frank Hamer reportedly came real close to saying that all charges against Henry in Texas would be dropped if Ivy cooperated. This ethically complex deal, leveraging a father's fear and a criminal's instinct for self-preservation, set the stage for the final confrontation.
Before dawn on May 23, 1934, a six-man posse organized by Frank Hamer concealed themselves in the bushes along the roadside of a lonely stretch of Louisiana State Highway 154, between the tiny towns of Gibbsland and Sales, in Bienville Parish. The team consisted of 4 Texas officers: Frank Hamer himself, fellow former Texas Ranger Manny Galt, and Dallas County deputies Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton. They were joined by 2 Louisiana lawmen, Bienville Parish Sheriff Henderson Jordan and his Chief Deputy Prentice Oakley.
The trap was set. Ivy Methvin, Henry's father, was instructed to park his truck on the side of the road, feigning a breakdown, a sight familiar to Clyde, who often stopped to help or at least converse with the Methvins. The posse had waited through the previous day and night, the atmosphere filled with tense anticipation. One of them, Deputy Hinton, actually knew Clyde and had a youthful crush on Bonnie from her waitressing days in Dallas, which added a layer of grim irony to his presence. He whispered to Deputy Alcorn as they awaited the outlaw's arrival, quote, "This is it. It's Clyde," end quote.
Around 9:15 a.m., Clyde's stolen Ford V8 approached. He slowed the car as he spotted Ivy Methvin's truck, though accounts from the posse members sometimes vary in the precise details. According to a joint statement by Deputies Hinton and Alcorn, quote, "There must have been a signal given, but who it came from is another thing. We just all acted together, stepped out into the road and raised our guns. We all yelled 'halt' at once. They didn't halt. We could see him grab at a gun in his lap. Bonnie was going for something on the other side. Then all hell broke loose," end quote.
Local Bienville Deputy Prentice Oakley is often credited with firing the first shot, possibly before a formal order was given, hitting Clyde in the head and killing him instantly. Deputy Hinton reported hearing Bonnie scream. The posse then unleashed a furious barrage. Hinton and Alcorn later stated that, quote, "We opened fire with the automatic rifles. They were emptied before the car even got to us. Then we used shotguns. We kept shooting at the car even after it stopped. We weren't taking any chances," end quote.
The sheer volume of ammunition flying through the air was overwhelming. Estimates range from 130 to over 167 bullets and buckshot riddling the Ford and its occupants. Film footage taken by the deputies immediately after the ambush show 112 bullet holes in the vehicle alone. The official coroner's report listed 17 entrance wounds on Clyde Barrow's body and 26 on Bonnie Parker's, including several headshots to each, and one that had severed Clyde's spinal column. Frank Hamer reportedly said afterwards, quote, "I hate to bust the cap on a woman, especially when she was sitting down. However, if it wouldn't have been her, it would have been us," end quote.
The immediate aftermath was chaotic. News of the ambush spread like wildfire, and a crowd quickly gathered at the scene. Onlookers, in a morbid frenzy, descended upon the bullet-riddled car, attempting to take souvenirs like pieces of clothing, locks of Bonnie's hair, shattered glass, shell casings. One man even reportedly tried to cut off Clyde's ear. The scene was a testament to the intense public fascination, however gruesome, that surrounded the outlaw couple.
The deaths of Bonnie and Clyde ignited a media frenzy and a public spectacle that underscored their legendary status. Tens of thousands of people flocked to the separate Dallas funeral homes where their bodies lay. The Dallas Morning News headline on May 24, 1934 bluntly announced, quote, "Posse kills Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker." The Evening Star in Washington, D.C. ran with, quote, "Outlaw Barrow and woman slain as speeding auto runs into ambush," end quote.
The funerals themselves were also chaotic. At Clyde's viewing, the crowd grew so large and unruly that some people had to be physically removed. Bonnie's mother, Emma Parker, refused her daughter's wish, expressed in her poetry, to be buried side by side with Clyde.
The impact on the families was devastating and long-lasting. Many were arrested and charged with harboring fugitives. The constant stress and public scrutiny took a heavy toll. Both Emma Parker and Clyde's mother, Cummy Barrow, died within 11 years of their children's violent end. The death car, as it came to be known, was even toured around the country as a macabre carnival attraction, further fueling the legend and the family's pain.
So, Michael, why, after all these decades, does the story of Bonnie and Clyde continue to captivate us?
Their tale was a potent cocktail of love, rebellion, violence, and tragedy, all set against the desperate backdrop of the Great Depression. As one historian put it, quote, "The media portrayed them as rebellious young lovers fighting against an unjust system. This romanticized image often overshadowed the brutal reality of their crimes, which included at least 13 murders, 9 of them law enforcement officers."
During the Depression, with widespread distrust of banks and government, some did view them as Robin Hood figures, striking back against an oppressive system. However, this was not a universal perception.
No, not at all. Other notorious outlaws of the era, like John Dillinger, reportedly dismissed Bonnie and Clyde as, quote, snot-nosed punks who gave bank robbing a bad name, primarily because their targets were often small, rural businesses rather than major financial institutions. Their actual takings were often meager, a far cry from the master criminals of popular imagination.
Their crime spree undoubtedly spurred changes in law enforcement. The challenges of pursuing outlaws across state lines highlighted the need for greater interagency cooperation and the development of more sophisticated tactics. And the Bureau of Investigation's role in coordinating the manhunt was a significant step in the evolution of federal law enforcement.
The cultural impact of Bonnie and Clyde has been immense and enduring. Their story has been retold and reinterpreted countless times in film, music, and literature. In 1967, Arthur Penn film Bonnie and Clyde, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, was a landmark, quote, tapping into the anti-establishment zeitgeist of the 1960s and redefining cinematic violence.
Interestingly, W.D. Jones apparently saw this 1967 film in which he was represented by a character named C.W. Moss. After seeing the movie, Jones stated, quote, "The character of Moss was a dumb kid who runs errands and done what Clyde told him. That was me, all right," end quote.
Numerous songs have also chronicled their exploits, from early folk ballads to tracks by artists like Merle Haggard, and even Jay-Z and Beyoncé's 2003 Bonnie and Clyde. Literary works include sensationalized accounts published shortly after their deaths, like the accounts published by Emma Parker, Bonnie's mother, as well as that of Blanche Barrow and other family members and participants. As we've noted, these accounts were often authored by people who had a reason to want to downplay their own actions or make certain actors appear more innocent.
The enduring romanticization of Bonnie and Clyde throughout all of those different forms of media likely stems from several factors: their youth, their undeniable love for each other, the dramatic and violent nature of their lives and deaths, and the backdrop of the Great Depression, which created a public hungry for figures who defied a seemingly broken system. Bonnie's own poetry, with its themes of fatalism and doomed love, also contributed significantly to their mythic status.
They were, as one academic paper puts it, fairly small-scale Texas robbers whose attainment of fame was a stuttering trajectory from aspirations through happenstance to deliberate cultivation, fueled by their own actions and amplified by the media.
Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, their story is a complex tapestry of love, violence, desperation, and myth. They were products of their time, their crimes a brutal response to a brutal era.
And in the end, Bonnie's own words proved to be their most accurate epitaph, a chilling prophecy fulfilled in the hail of gunfire on a dusty Louisiana road. Quote, "Someday they'll go down together, but it's death for Bonnie and Clyde." I'm Michael.
And I'm Alana. Join us next time on History's Greatest Crimes as we unravel another dark chapter from the past.
As always,
stay curious.